Ms. Northcutt, it's great to have you with us today at KPCC. We appreciate it. Let me just start off, describe what it was like for you sitting in mission control 50 years ago for that Apollo 11 mission.
Well, it was exciting, but it was also just a lot of work, to be honest with you. You have to concentrate very hard. You have to be very into the mission and pretty much shut everything else out.
And so the degree of concentration, I'm just assuming, was incredibly intense. You're all very, very focused on the moment. And as you're communicating with the fellow members of your team, what are the particular challenges where everything has to be very, very quickly decided and communicated?
That's correct. You have to listen very carefully too, because you're listening to multiple channels at the same time. You'll have 3 or 4 channels going where you're hearing the audio, and you have to learn how to sort through what you need to pay attention to and what you can ignore. When I first went in there, that was the biggest challenge, was figuring that out.
Your team designed the return to Earth trajectory for Apollo 8. Now,
for all of them.
Yeah, but I mean, it wasn't 8 was the first one, though, right? So beginning with 8, was there anything in the subsequent missions that you changed, or once you have a successful Apollo 8, the trajectory is set?
Well, it's not the trajectory that's set, it's the computations are set, because you calculate every trajectory live in real time based on the exact position of the spacecraft. There were still some modifications that were being made. There's always, you have a big software program, there's almost always going to be some little bug or some little something that you need to adjust. But there were no major changes that were made in those preliminary missions. We had begun working on more advanced missions that were never flown to try to do more exotic, more challenging flights to the moon.
What's an example of that? A mission
high inclination, polar orbits, things like that.
And that would, the advantage of that would be to see parts of the moon that otherwise wouldn't have been.
Exactly. All we ever saw was the equator. I mean, would you really think you'd explored the Earth if all you saw was the equator?
You identified some mistakes in the plan before it ended up being executed. Can you describe what were those math errors, for example, or what were some of the corrections that you made?
Well, there's a couple of different things. One thing has to do with errors that are in the computer program itself, and those were errors that would be identified before flight and corrected, bugs that are corrected in the real-time computer complex. So we had some of those, especially before 8, that we had to identify. They accelerated the schedule on 8. They cut off 2 months of our time to get that ready to go. So that was very intensive in trying to get that done. In terms of errors in mission control, it's not that I was identifying errors. We, during a mission, would work on verifying hundreds and hundreds of returns to Earth that were being just looked at, not necessarily because we planned to fly them, but because you always want to be ready and know what your alternatives are in case something comes up. So I think the thing that when people talk about this little clip that they may see, that was not a planned trans-Earth injection. That was just something that the retrofire officer was looking at as a possibility. He was looking at minimizing his trip time, and so he just really didn't realize that he needed more fuel. That was why he was having problems. He didn't have the fuel constraints high enough.
All right. What were you and your team members doing during the crew-threatening Apollo 13? What was your role in that mission?
Our role was the same in all missions. Our role was to be there to do a return trajectory if they were in the vicinity of the moon, whether it was good times or bad. We developed what was initially called the abort program. And that's what it was really for, was to handle emergency situations. It ended up being used for nominal as well as aborts. So anytime you wanted to come back to the Earth from the moon, it was our program that was being used. So during Apollo 13, It was actually the first time the program was used for what it was designed for, aborts. And while it may sound, it was a challenging situation because we had had an explosion on board. We had lost the main spacecraft engine. But for what we were doing, we didn't have any real challenge particularly because we had already simulated doing what we did. That was part of our contingency planning, was that we might have to return using the descent propulsion system.
So that was determined. The question was, could it be executed? Would the spacecraft be able to do it?
Right, right, exactly. I mean, we had simulated using the ascent propulsion system, the descent propulsion system. We had simulated and viewed all of those as contingencies that might occur during the course of a mission. The real challenge at Apollo 13 was with the environmental challenge, because those people had to figure out how to do what they were going to do in real time. We knew what to do. We had already really looked at that.
So for your team, was Apollo 8, because it was the first, really the most nerve-wracking?
It was. Well, I mean, and it's hard to say. I mean, was 13 more nerve-wracking? The thing about 13 was you didn't know how bad it was. That was the whole thing. I mean, we knew that if the descent propulsion system was working, we could use it and we could come home. We knew we had enough fuel. We knew how to do that. But what you didn't know was the thing that was worrying. You don't know what you don't know. And we didn't know until they actually re-entered and separated at re-entry how extensive that damage was on that spacecraft. Fortunately, the descent propulsion system was available, it was usable, and we got them home fine. On 8, that was a mission that was challenging on paper when you started. 13 was not particularly challenging at time 0, you know, looking forward to what is planned as a mission. But 8 was very difficult in terms of its plan from the beginning.
Also wanted to ask you about, speaking of, you don't know what you don't know. During that period of time that the spacecraft with astronauts is on the back side of the moon and you lose communication, what does that feel like during that period?
That's very nerve-wracking because you are sitting there with the great unknown. That back side of the moon is where they do all the major maneuvers. At least that's what's planned for, because that's the most efficient place to do those maneuvers. That's where you have the best use of the moon's gravity. But you're out of communication with them.
And
so.
For how long? How many minutes?
30, 40 minutes. It's a pretty good stretch. And so you don't know what's going on. You know they're supposed to do a maneuver. You don't know if the engine did light up, did it not light up, did it overburn, did it underburn. And you have to wait until they come around and you acquire signal. And once you acquire signal, then you have to wait for guidance data to come in, tracking and guidance data. That's a few minutes. If something was really bad, you don't have a lot of time to fix it.
And for your team, was there any one of these missions where you had to just quickly come up with new computations to solve a problem?
Not really, not really. We never had one of those bad situations. On Apollo 8, I mean, we were quickly coming up with things every revolution on Apollo 8 because the mass concentrations had not been mapped at that time. So we were coming up with, and the Capcom was reading up new maneuvers for every revolution, 2 maneuvers for every revolution that we went around. So we were, I saw a report, I had forgotten about it until I dug in my storage unit recently, and I came up with it, and it was talking about what we did during Apollo 8. Our team did more than 400 trans-Earth injections. Verified more than 400 during that mission. And that was over a time period that would have been maybe 30 hours.
Wow, 430 hours.
30, maybe 40 hours, but I mean,
that's pressure-packed.
So that's a lot of maneuvers that we were verifying. And those were not all maneuvers. Obviously, we were not planning on doing those maneuvers, but those were alternative maneuvers in case we had to do an abort, in case we needed to know how fast can we get home, just alternatives.
So as it's in progress, you're looking at all these contingencies, so you've got plan B, C, D, whatever, ready to go.
Ready to go. And you're still going to have to calculate it live at the moment. But you want to already know what you're dealing with. You want to know, okay, if this comes up, this is what I need to do. And yeah, I'm going to calculate live and get the latest, you know, down to the last digit. But you want to know ahead of time.
Were you and your colleagues in the Apollo missions, was your assumption at the time you're doing these missions that this is all prelude to work on going to Mars? Did you just assume this was sort of just transition into planning for Mars?
I thought we would have landed. If you talked to me during the flight of Apollo 11, I would have said, oh yeah, we'll probably be on Mars in 10, 15 years.
Wow. And so are you disappointed that here we are in 2019 and you know, we're not there?
I'm heartbroken. I'm heartbroken. I've been heartbroken. I mean, how worse can it be that we have to hitchhike into space? We don't even have a launch vehicle yet. We haven't had a launch vehicle for years.
Well, and where do you put the blame for that? Because there was, during this era where you have an important role in the Apollo and Gemini before that, there's this feeling of everybody pulling together, can do whatever it takes to spend. So how did the U.S. lose that in your view?
Well, you ask about where do I put the blame. I mean, maybe it should be reframed. I mean, maybe we should look at where do we put the credit for what we did, okay? And looking at it 50 years later, I sure am glad that Lyndon B Johnson was president, because Lyndon B Johnson is the one that got the money.
So despite the fact John F. Kennedy threw the gauntlet down.
He had the vision, he had the charisma, he had the magnetism, he had all of that. But he did not have the sticks to get the money through Congress. He couldn't get anything through Congress. I went back and reread Cairo's book about Johnson.
Robert Cairo.
Robert Cairo. And it's a fantastic series, okay? I can hardly wait for the last one. He's still working on one. But it was Johnson. It was Johnson that got all of that through. And for the years he was in office, 6 years roughly, and if you look at the numbers show that when he was in office, it was between 4 and 5% of the national budget that was going to NASA.
Wow.
No, we have not had anyone since. I'm not sure if we ever had anyone before LBJ who had the knowledge of the strings to pull and the levers to push in the Senate and in the House to work his way, you know, with the budget.
I wanted to also ask you about the movie Hidden Figures, because you were a computress doing that work before becoming an engineer and part of mission control, doing these computations. Did the film get the sense of the room and the work right, or were there so many liberties taken for the movie that it didn't feel authentic to you?
Well, it didn't. And to a certain extent, I don't know, because those women were at Langley. They were not in Houston. And the time was different as well. That was set in a time period of the late 50s. It was definitely before the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, because you see them picketing, demonstrating, things like that. So the 1964 Civil Rights Act, I went to work right in 1965. And of course in Houston rather than in Virginia. So the climate was different. There were huge changes that went on in that period, but the 1964 Civil Rights Act was really a watershed piece of legislation. It included non-discrimination in employment on the basis of race, creed, color, sex, and national origin. And it didn't change instantly people's hiring practices, not by a long shot. There's still employment discrimination. But it certainly had a significant effect pretty quickly.
You look back to being the only woman in mission control, and you became a focal point as a result of that. People interviewed you, there were profiles. Your gender conveyed a status at that whole era. And as you look at that now, do you see that as largely positive? Is there any downside to that as you think about it?
Well, it was a lot of the treatment by the media was very sexist, and I would have preferred to have been the 100th woman in mission control. But I felt it was an opportunity getting out there to let other women know that women could do those jobs. And I think that that was a positive. In fact, I know for certain it was.
I was going to ask if you heard from women who saw you in those interviews or read about you.
Exactly. See, I was contacted by the Brazilian consulate 6-8 weeks ago about a woman at JPL who was a Brazilian born, Brazilian raised, who wanted to locate me because when she was a little girl, she said that she was influenced to go into planetary science because she saw news coverage of me out of Apollo 13.
That's got to be very gratifying.
Pretty amazing.
Yeah. And then you went on, after leaving TRW and your contract work for NASA, to get your law degree.
Yes.
And to go into civil rights and advocacy law. So how much of that was a direct outgrowth of your unique status within NASA?
Well, it was definitely a big factor. And it's hard to separate and figure out what exactly is this factor versus that factor. What was happening on the planet, in the United States in general, was that we had a women's rights movement that was growing. And I became interested in that. I mean, perhaps even without all of that, I might have still ended up going in that direction. But it was eye-opening to be the first woman in mission control. Not that I hadn't been the first and only woman in a room full of men, having been the computerist and just working at TRW. But all of that fed into my understanding of how much discrimination in the workforce that women faced, not because I was actually facing so much of it. Yes, I was experiencing pay discrimination. Yes, I experienced a whole bunch of stuff, but the truth of the matter is I was privileged relative to most women.
And you described, because everybody's so into their work at NASA, that there was almost less space for direct gender discrimination, but because you started in a lower paid position as a computress, it was impossible to catch up.
Exactly. Absolutely, and it still is for women in that situation. In fact, when I was promoted, I had a very progressive boss. If I hadn't had this progressive boss, I don't know if I would have been promoted. He had told me after I'd been there 6 months as a computerist that he was expecting to promote me when I would, at the end of my first year. But the promotion didn't come, and it was like 2 or 3 months later, and when he met with me, he was apologizing for that. And he was explaining why that had not happened sooner. And his explanation was that he had to fight with corporate headquarters and just to get the promotion, because it was such a large step pay-wise. And that he had still been fighting with them, and he finally gave up. He said he just gave up about that, just to get me to the bottom of the pay scale. That he still felt I was underpaid. But he had just had enormous trouble just being able to do the promotion to the bottom of the pay scale. And he said he would continue to work, and he did, at trying to close that gap. But he concluded by saying it would have been easier to have fired you and rehired you.
Because then you wouldn't have had the starting pay scale
Exactly.
to deal with.
Exactly. So knowing that, I mean, I felt like I was in a good position to speak out for other women, because they were experiencing these things too, whether they were aware of them or not. They were.
You've been out of engineering a long time, but given you know, your iconic status, I assume you get a chance to talk with NASA folks, engineers, scientists. You're surrounded. So are there any differences just sort of temperamentally or personality from the folks that you worked with in the mid-'60s to this generation of scientists and engineers?
I think there probably is, okay? I think there probably is. First of all, because go back to where we were 50 years ago and what was going on in the space race. First of all, NASA, yes, it was a civilian agency, but it was very influenced in its culture by the military. I think it's less influenced in its culture by the military at this time. You know, just because it's evolved more as a civilian agency with, you know, it still has some military feel to it, but I think that's a big difference for one thing. Also, we have an influx. We have women in positions, flight directors, flight controllers, and so forth in these non-manned missions. And if you look around the room, everybody in there is not white anymore.
In fact, it's international.
Exactly. But they're not, you know, you look at those pictures from the Mission Operations Control Room, what do you see?
Yeah.
A whole bunch of white men. In white shirts, even. I mean, they're even, you know, yeah. They're even all dressed alike. They're all in what we used to call the IBM dress code.
Mm-hmm. Pocket protector and everything with it. I also wanted to ask you finally about, you have a lunar landmark named after you.
I think that is a rumor. I do not think that is true.
Okay.
I don't think
well,
that
you
is
can
true.
Dispel that. There's
well,
no crater named for you?
I don't think there is a crater that's named for me.
There should be.
Well, I mean,
we'll start there.
I'm happy for you to lobby for it. And I love the rumor, but I don't think it's true.
All right. Poppy, thank you so much for talking with us. We appreciate it very much. And just finally...
well, I love public radio.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And I assume you're a longtime supporter of public radio in Houston, your home city.
Absolutely.
All right, very good. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate it very much.
Great, thank you.